Welcome, everyone. My name is Alex Weiser. I'm the Director of Public Programs of the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. We're so pleased to have you here with us today for this collaborative event with the Bodleian Library at Oxford. We're going to be talking about Jewish children's literature that is in both of our collections, and we'll have a really nice mix of kind of introduction to these genres in general, and also a kind of peek into some of the material of our collections themselves. Just a word about YIVO for those that don't know YIVO. YIVO is a special place for the contemplation and celebration of Jewish history and Jewish culture. We have a library and an archive with over 23 million documents and over 400,000 books, which are used by researchers from around the world. In addition to making these materials available, we do a variety of classes, exhibitions, and public programs like this one to bring the world of those collections alive for people. Without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Richard Undone from the Bodleian Library.
Thank you very much indeed, Alex, and colleagues. Welcome to this collaborative webinar with YIVO and the Bodleian Libraries. My name is Richard Undone. I have a strange job title, which is called Bodleian Librarian, which means I'm responsible for the historic institution, the Bodleian Library, and the group of libraries which are centrally funded by the university here in Oxford. And I'm the 25th person to hold that esteemed title. Now, I had the great pleasure of visiting YIVO in 2018 when I was doing some of my own personal research, and I had such a fabulous experience with Stephanie and other colleagues there that I thought it would be wonderful to see if we could form some kind of collaboration between the Bodleian and YIVO. And my colleagues in New York were equally enthused at the idea. And so it's taken a little while for us to begin the process of collaboration, and this is the first of those efforts that we've been able to work up. And obviously the pandemic has been somewhat distracting in that period, but it's really exciting for us all to be working together. We have an absolute stellar panel of scholars and librarians on both sides of the Atlantic who are coming together with books to talk to you about Russian, Jewish, and Yiddish children's literature. But I want to say that more importantly, from the Bodleian's perspective, we have collections which are extremely relevant in the field of Russian studies, but also in Hebrew and Jewish studies. And indeed, we have a specialist library, the Leopold Müller Memorial Library, which is dedicated to the study and research into Jewish and Hebrew studies, but also the Bodleian itself, the historic institution, has been collecting and interested in Hebrew studies from its foundation in the early 17th century. Indeed, our founder, Sir Thomas Bodley, was deeply interested and could read some Hebrew himself. So it's a great pleasure for this event to be happening. I'm very excited to learn more myself, and without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our team of scholars and librarians. Thank you.
I'm Katerina Kelly, and so I'm going to start the discussion of these books by talking about the Opis collection in the Bodleian Library. My qualification for that is I'm Professor of Russian at the University of Oxford, and I published in 2007 a book called Children's World, which was a century of children's history in Russia and the Soviet Union. And the Opis collection has got an absolutely wonderful, small but perfectly formed collection of children's books in Russian and some absolute gems by Jewish artists. And you can see on the very first page is a little drawing by Natalia Satsyuk, whom I'm going to come to later. But before I talk about the Jewish authors in the collection, I'm just going to say a very little bit about the collection generally. And let me just go on to slideshow, I hope. And here we go. Right. I think I could have to do it like this, sort of going down. But this is a dedication to the Opis from Emmanuel Marshak, who is the son of one of the most famous Russian Jewish authors of children's books, Samuel Marshak, whom I'll come to later. But the Opis were very well-known folklorists and really interested in sort of everything to do with children's culture, and visited the USSR in 1967 and appear to have bought their books. There doesn't seem to be much in the way of exact documentation of this in secondhand bookshops in the Soviet Union, which was then a really good way of acquiring books. You could just go into these fantastic secondhand collections and export them, which certainly wasn't the case later on. And the 1960s and onwards books are mainly to do with children's folklore, and they're often translations into Russian of British children's folklore, so not nearly so interesting for Russianists. But there are some wonderful ones from later on. But just a few things more generally about the collection. I'm giving you some examples of work which is not by Russian Jewish, Ukrainian Jewish, or Belarusian Jewish artists, but by other really well-known figures. So there's some wonderful things from before 1917. So here, for example, we've got two illustrated books, and I'm going to be concentrating on illustrated books. So on the left-hand side, Georgi Nalbut's illustrations, so these wonderfully sort of ballet russe illustrations, so also world of art, so the sort of classic Russian painting of the sort of 1900s, 1910s. And then on the right-hand side, we have Alexandre Benoit, who is very well known as a stage designer particularly, but did this fantastic alphabet book where not only are the things that are named in the alphabet, but you can actually see in the picture lots of other examples of items with that letters to get children sort of interested and engaged with the book. Some Soviet examples. So here's Naughty Dolly, for example, by Fyodor Lebedev and Konstantin Rotov. And a particular favorite of mine, Lydia Popova, Delicious Things. So all these luscious pictures of food. Coming on to the Jewish artists, though, and I should emphasize that by Jewish, I am talking in absolutely the broadest possible sense. And there's a sort of complication in that before 1917, as you may well know, that officially speaking, Jewish was simply a religion. It had no kind of ethnic component, and Yiddish was a language. And after 1917, there was a sort of glorious 15 years when nobody bothered about anybody's nationality except to give them extra opportunities. And then in 1932, the Soviet passport was introduced, and very rapidly it included nationality, and that included Jewish nationality. So what was known as point number 5, and led to all kinds of discriminatory practices. But in the 15 years when a lot of these books were produced, there is sort of golden opportunities for people with a Jewish background from all kinds of different families. So my first example is Nina Simonovich Femaver, and she comes from a really interesting family because her parents actually founded the first kindergarten in the Russian Empire. And it's a nice example of how many of these Jewish artists and writers from educated backgrounds came from exactly the sort of families that were interested in free education. And the other interesting thing about her is that she's mainly not known as an illustrator. She was mainly an art puppeteer, a sculptress, and actually this beautiful design, although done very late, it's one of the latest, probably the latest illustration I'm going to show you, is very like the sort of thing that was done in the 1910s. It looks much earlier. She just didn't really change after 1917. Continuing to a very different figure, this is David Sterlingburgh, so originally from Zhytomyr in the Jewish Pale, so in modern day Ukraine. And he then trained as a photographer's apprentice in Odessa, but rapidly made his way to Moscow when he became a really important figure in the avant-garde arts movement, working in this very interesting style, which is somewhere between suprematism and cubism. So highly kind of schematized, very graphic. And his children's book, My Toys, is one of a series of children's books that are absolutely splendid. They're done with actually quite low production values in some ways, but they do absolutely kind of leap out at you. These illustrations done on fairly low quality paper, they really do live on the page. Marshak, whom I mentioned earlier, and he's an enormously important organizing figure. I mean, his background is really interesting because he came from the family of a Belarusian artisan who'd moved to southern Russia, but he's a child prodigy, and he's made a kind of a protege of Maxim Gorky through Vladimir Stasov, who's a major critic. Then Gorky takes him up, and he's recognized very rapidly as a major talent. And despite being sort of involved in what would be seen as sort of Zionist causes, I mean, so he writes a poem to Herzl. He sheds that background and becomes this major organizing figure in the Soviet Union. And throughout his life is really one of the foremost artists, despite suffering some really quite difficult political problems, including a major purge twice on his Leningrad section of the children's literature department. And he often works with, in fact, non-Jewish artists, and Vladimir Lebedev is a case in point. Now, here's somebody that I think everyone will have heard of, so El Lisitsky, so a world-famous artist. Probably fewer people would know that he created children's books. I certainly didn't. I didn't know anything about this book, but Two Squares is an absolutely wonderful example. He's another person from the Pale, originally of Belarusian background, trained as an architect in Germany and becomes part of the international modernist movement. So a really interesting trajectory there as well. Nina Saxonskaya, so born Antonina Grushman, is from an interesting figure. So Nina Simonovich, Efimova's mother, had in fact converted, her family had converted the Berkmans to Lutheranism, but Saxonskaya's mother wasn't Jewish at all. She actually came from a landowning family. And her father was originally from Odessa, worked as a journalist, but then went into the oil industry in Baku. So she grew up in this very comfortable background. But the book that I've chosen is one that was really well known and was used to teach Soviet children, Russian-speaking children, about colors, and was reprinted very many times. But this shows you a nice illustration in a rather later style than some of the others. So when there's more traditional work being done in the 1930s. So just three more of them, and this is Amir Batov, who is the sort of artist and, well, rather the writer, and the artists are actually by Laptiev. So she's the sort of author that you couldn't avoid knowing about if you went to Soviet school. So her poems were regularly set for learning by heart. A very typical example of her work in the 1930s is a book published in 1937 called At the Border Post, which is about how a small boy sees this foreigner lurking by the border and sees that he's suspicious, so he reports him to the border guards. It's an absolute classic of the sort of late 1930s kind of Soviet isolationism. And I've chosen a much more endearing example of her work, which is the 1st of May, March 1931, so a sort of different period, a much more internationalist period. And also a really interesting figure. She was born in Lithuania and made her way to this really prominent position in Soviet children's institutions. Natalia Satsyuk, I mentioned at the beginning, and she's by far better known actually as a theatre entrepreneur, pioneer of children's theatre. She worked with Prokofiev on Peter and the Wolf, but it turns out that she did this illustrated book, so stories, when she was really very young. She did everything, not quite as, I suspect, as young as she said. I mean, I suspect she may have shaved a few years off her age, as Batov certainly did as well, but it's certainly really kind of immensely energetic at an early stage. And again, a really interesting background. Both parents worked in music and the theatre, and her mother again wasn't Jewish, but Sats then later married one of the sort of Soviet commissars, so the commissar of trade, who was also like her from a partly Jewish, well, in his case, a wholly Jewish background. So she can definitely be included here. And you see this rather wonderful picture of a Leningrad tram, which has got its exact destination. Actually, it's going to the Baltic station. Okay, so the final figure is Lev Ivanov, so a rather less well-known, but a pupil of Malevich, really interesting, wrote a diary about Malevich, appears simultaneously to have been penning reports on Yunovis, so the sort of the avant-garde movement in Leningrad, to the secret police. So one of these ambiguous figures, but I prefer here to celebrate his work. And I think one of the interesting things about this image that I want to finish with is that it actually is very much something that's appreciably Jewish in a way that possibly you couldn't say about any of the other ones in a very direct way. So it does look like a scene from a shtetl. But anyway, they are fantastic examples of a period when, as I say, it was relatively straightforward to live as a Jew in the territory of what had been the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, and when there's this surge of creativity in all sorts of areas. And I think that the children's books should be as well known as the work for adults, music, painting, theatre design, and so on. So I'll finish there. Thank you very much for your attention.
Welcome, everybody. I am Cesar Merton-Hamann. I am the Victor Blanc Curator of Hebraica and Judaica at the Bodleian Library and the Director of the Leopold Muller Memorial Library, which is, as Richard observed, the Hebrew and Jewish Studies Library in the system of the Bodleian Libraries at the University of Oxford. We're going to do a whirlwind tour of children's books in Hebrew, most of them published in Mandate Palestine in the 1930s and 40s, before the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. This will give us a view of what the priorities were of those involved in the writing of children's literature. I'll start with the translations of the classics of children's literature. And you're seeing right now on your left, I hope, Rudyard Kipling's Just So Stories, and on the right, Gulliver's Travels in Hebrew. This is part of the program whereby classical children's literature was translated into Hebrew. And in many cases, words were introduced from foreign cultures as well. We go on to different kind of translations now. We have here on the right, you have Pushkin, which, as so many of the Russian and Polish classics, was immediately translated into Hebrew. And on the left, we have something which is not so common, which is a translation of children's poetry originally written in Yiddish by Kadia Molodowski, and which was translated by a team of stars, would later be the greatest Hebrew poets, some of the greatest Hebrew poets of the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, including Leah Goldberg and Natan Alterman. So this is what was part of the program, because it was a program. And right now, this is an absolutely beautiful example of the printing of Hebrew books for children in continental Europe. This particular story, the story of the 5 blind men who meet an elephant, was published in Germany in the 1920s. The productions of this sort of materials in Mandate Palestine were, of course, not at the same high level of technical expertise. You can see on the top Chaim Nachman Bialik's retelling of some of the stories of what are really Jewish folk stories, but of course they come in many cases from the Bible. In this case, the story of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. And on the right below, you can see Levin Kipnis's Ofer, which was part of a series of 20 readers for children. You must remember that most children came from homes where the parents did not speak Hebrew. So they had to get all their Hebrew, so to speak, what you would get at home, they had to get it in school and from other children. And this was what these readers, which contained nursery rhymes and lullabies and poetry and stories, were meant to do. Now, here we have something interesting, and it is the fact that one of the greatest storytellers in Mandate Palestine for children, Nahum Goodman, was also one of the great artists of Mandate Palestine and then later of the State of Israel. His books have been described, I think it was Amir Batov, who said that he loved his stories because he never tried to teach anything. He just told a good story. And he illustrated his books, as you can see here, and they are still loved, I believe, because they certainly are still in print. Now, this here, Dahlia, written by Yemima Chernovitz, who was one of the team of women who were absolutely predominant, not just productive, but they produced poetry, plays, all sorts of genres, stories, and also some of the textbooks and the reading materials. This was all done through the journals for children, which were published by most of the main newspapers. The most important one was the newspaper Davar, which published Davar Liyeladim, but Haaretz and Bustanai and many of the other newspapers also had supplements for children. And these supplements published stories and poetry. And in this particular case, Dahlia, it's a storytelling children, the life of a child in Mandate Palestine, in the new Zionist Yishuv. And this was read also by children who had just arrived, and it helped those children become part of the new society, part of the new environment. So,
can you turn some of the pages, Cesar?
Oh, by all means. This is Dahlia. The drawings are by Nahum Goodman. You can see that they talk about life as it was at the time, the train, the bus, and what children were supposed to be living through. This is this girl with her horse in the moshav, which is absolutely lovely. The typeface, I don't know if you can see it well enough, but the typeface is beautiful. Even though the resources were limited. And it's amazing to see how even during the war, when paper was rationed and it was so difficult to get things printed, children's books were a priority, and they continued to be printed throughout the wartime. And you can see here another, this is Zev, but this is another book illustrated by Nahum Goodman. So it's the story of a young sailor, but it's all told in poetry. The books are still, many of them are still in print, but what we have here are the originals. They are all part of the Hyams collection and the El-Koshi collection at the Leopold Müller Memorial Library, which are all collections of the Oxford Center for Hebrew and Jewish Studies, which basically pioneered Hebrew and Jewish studies of the modern kind at the university. And last but not least, it's a book by Fania Bergstein. Like so many of our authors. She had a very difficult life. She died young. I don't think she reached the age of 50. But in the time that she had, she managed to produce an amazing amount of stories and poetry for children. She was a school teacher herself, I think. It shows us that in many cases, these books were much more important than one would, certainly in a Western European society, one would think a children's book is, as I said, because they filled a vacuum that was absolutely crucial for children. It helped them get the words to describe the things they saw, and it gave them not just the vocabulary, but it gave them the possibility to articulate their feelings and the experiences they were living. So I think that this is an absolutely wonderful collection, which actually ties up very well with what was being done in the world of Yiddish. So I will stop here, and we can continue listening to our next speaker. Thank you.
I'm Miriam Udell. Okay, great. I don't see it myself, but if you say I'm spotlighted, there we go. Okay, so Miriam Udell, I teach Yiddish language, literature, and culture at Emory University. And since 2013, I've been deeply involved in a multi-part project studying Yiddish children's literature. The first major fruits of that project came into the public last October with the publication of Honey on the Page by New York University Press. This is an anthology of Yiddish children's literature, and I'm now working on a companion volume that will be a critical study of that corpus. I have long been an admirer of Professor Kelly's work on Soviet children's literature in Russian, and it's thrilling to have been, to have heard from her today, as well as to see these books up close, some of which I have had close encounters with at YIVO, and some of which I've only seen digitized as scans, and some of which are entirely new to me. So it's very exciting. I'm going to share my screen with you now, and remembering to choose. Okay, I think we've got it. Okay, so this is kind of a fun graphic that New York University Press made in order to show the geographic reach of Yiddish children's literature. When I say Yiddish children's literature, I don't mean all of it that ever existed, but I do mean most of it. And what I'm talking about specifically is a corpus of texts that really began at the turn of the 20th century in dribs and drabs, and then became a major cultural force in the transnational Yiddish-speaking world in the 19-teens, 20s, and 30s, was severely impacted by the events of the Holocaust and also by purges under Stalin, but that saw something of a recrudescence in the 1950s and continued in its sort of classical form until the 1970s, again becoming more of a dribs and drabs situation throughout the 60s and 70s. This map shows the settings of the work that's collected in Honey on the Page, although not the places of publication. The places of publication are also quite global, covering 4 continents. So I'm not going to give you a complete history of Yiddish children's literature in 15 minutes, but I do, in my remarks, want to emphasize some of the range and the diversity of this corpus before going into a couple of specific primary texts. I hope it will be a couple, it might just be one. So first of all, that geographical range, the 4 continents. Then the other important thing to understand about this literature was that it was really undertaken as a project that was always bound up with Jewish politics. That was true in Eastern and Central Europe with the beginnings of publishing these books in Lithuania and in Poland. It was true in the Americas. New York became the major center of publishing, but the publishing activity also took place in Detroit, Boston, Montreal, Los Angeles, Mexico City, Buenos Aires, as well as a few other places. And that among these Yiddishists who were part of a broadly conceived left, there were 4 main ideological stripes that we can point to. So there were the Yiddishists of the Sholem Aleichem Folk Institute, who really placed the emphasis on Yiddish itself as their orientation. They had a kind of broadly secular sense of Yiddish culture rooted in Jewish experience, Jewish holidays, Jewish history, and Jewish ethics. They might have called themselves just Yiddish, kind of in parallel to how some people today will say, if you ask them, oh, well, how do you identify Jewishly? People will sometimes say, I'm just Jewish. So this was the just Yiddish option. There were Zionists, mostly labor Zionists, so they were part of the left. They had a socialist program, and they believed that the best and ultimate flourishing of the Jewish people in the future would be in the historic land of Israel. There were socialists of a couple of different stripes, but the largest and most significant was the Bundists, who were very intentional about both their use of Yiddish and their preservation of a distinctive Jewish identity, even as they also turned outward to a broader world and the desire to amend that broader world politically through collective action and the unification of the workers. And then out sort of beyond that was the communists, certainly in the Soviet Union, communists writing in Yiddish, and in the Americas and in Europe, although less publishing activity in Europe. For many of the communist authors and cultural leaders, Yiddish was a means, a sort of incidental means to the end of the proletarian revolution and the unification of the workers of the world. Nevertheless, they produced some extraordinary cultural artifacts working in Yiddish. So that's the ideological diversity of Yiddish children's literature as a corpus. Then there's also a great deal of aesthetic diversity, and I'm going to highlight just one question, one sort of continuum along which we might place certain books and authors, and that is the question of realism versus strongly imaginative or whimsical elements. So the quick way to gauge where a work falls out along that continuum is whether the animals, the objects, anyone other than human beings, can they talk? So for example, Labzik was published in 1935, written by Chaver Paver, the pen name of Gershon Einbinder, published by the International Workers' Order, which was the communist-aligned mutual aid society that had a system of Yiddish after schools that American children, mostly in New York, but in several other places as well, would attend in the afternoon after their morning in public school. And Labzik is a very, very clever puppy protagonist. He can do just about everything except talk, because Chaver Paver had an absolutely programmatic commitment to realism. Then there is the formal diversity. We have prose, poetry, drama, alphabet books, all kinds of sort of micro genres that we see in children's literature. We also have a range of occupations and positions, sort of societal positions for the respective authors of these works. Some of them were full-time educators, educational administrators, if not classroom teachers, as in the case of Eliezer Steinberg. Some of them were dedicated children's authors. They might have written sort of in parallel for an adult readership and a youth readership, like Katya Molodovsky, one of whose books we saw a moment ago. Some of them were mostly mainstream adult authors. We can think of Mesha Kulbak, we can think of Sholem Ash, even the most high-octane authors for adults in Yiddish, and this is also largely true in Hebrew, would try their hand at writing something for children. It was just kind of a cultural civic good that many, many authors seemed to try their hand at, even when they had such a sort of dark orientation. I'm thinking of a children's story by Yisrael Rabon. I'm thinking of poetry by Dovid Hofstein, where they were writing things that are so violent that it would be pretty unimaginable to put them before children today in the 21st century. Nevertheless, these high culture authors did write something for children. And of course, there are books, and then there's a whole other world of periodicals, some of which had print runs that lasted for several decades. And I know that YIVO has just about all of the significant ones in pretty complete print runs. So that's another exciting resource to mention. So I want to talk a little bit, I do want to get to a primary text. I want to talk about Libkritko. Born in 1890, his birth date is only approximate. He died, unfortunately, we know exactly when, August 12th, 1952, which many of you will recognize as the night of the murdered poets. He was born near Odessa. He was orphaned in childhood. He had a very working class, hand to mouth sort of a childhood. He sent some of his poetry off to the critic Shmuel Niger, Shmuel Charny, and it was rather coldly rejected, but he was resilient, and he sent work also to the modernist master David Bergelsen, who was much more encouraging. He put together a sort of informal education, almost like a general equivalency diploma program for Libkritko, just calling on private tutors. He moved to Kiev in 1917. He was wearing these sort of rustic homemade garments when he went out, when he started going to the cafes where Yiddish writers gathered. He was heralded as a folk, and we say in Yiddish, folkstimlich, a sort of folkloristic kind of a talent. He moved to Germany in the 20s. He joined the Communist Party. He got himself in a little bit of hot water. He fled back to Soviet Russia in 1925, evading arrest in Germany. He edited a literary journal in Kharkov. He wrote a satirical poem that offended the wrong editor in Moscow, and he was sent to work for a couple of years at a tractor factory, sort of out in the countryside. But he continued writing, and he came to be championed by Kornei Shukhovsky, who was himself a really important writer in Russian for children. And Shukhovsky helped Kvitko to gain translation into Russian, and the print runs of his books, which are very helpfully recorded in the end papers of all Soviet era children's literature. They went from 3,000, 5,500, 10,000 in Yiddish. I think that was his largest run in Yiddish, to 10 million when he was translated into Russian. So he really became a literary figure for mass consumption. He was in good official standing throughout the 30s and the 1940s. He was decorated, but it did him no good in the end. This is one of his books, very charmingly illustrated. The illustrations are a little blurry. I don't have access to the originals. He also wrote this story, Atzig mit sieben Ziegelech, a nanny goat with 7 kids, which I have translated in Honey on the Page. But in my remaining time, I want to take a quick look at this wonderful narrative poem, Boots und die Sanitaren. It tells the story of this little boy, Boots, and the sanitation agents who are sent by the Soviet state to his unnamed shtetl, because there is a cold, a Qatar going around, and the children of the shtetl need to be bathed, which the state steps in to do in the absence of any parental care. And the absence of parental care is one of the most important themes that cuts across the work of Libkritko, because it really is the state and its agents who are going to instruct and care for a child, even in the most intimate ways. So it's actually, it sounds kind of dark, but it's a really fun poem about a little boy who is kind of gluttonous. He loves to eat. And I'll just read you a couple of stanzas. Off somewhere in a shtetl far flung lived a boy, one of those guys with shining eyes and cheeks for weeks and such a tongue. To him, a book might as well be a brick. Just keep the sweet crepes coming quick, and pancakes and dumplings for his tummy's grumblings, plate after plate, and then a smidgen more he ate. So then we learn that he loves to eat, he hates to bathe, and the sanitation agents that you saw pictured here, very tall, very almost grotesque proportions, they come to his house and they grab him. Why, that's him, yes. And he pointed out the lad. Soon as his words reached the boy's ears, one of his eyes filled up with tears, and the dumpling he was eating, well, it knew not what to do. That dumpling got stuck in his throat mid-chew. The bathman sang out shrill as trumpet's metal, a cold is going round the shtetl. What a punk, what a craw, such filthy funk, his dirty maw. Grab that Boots, that grubby schlub, drag him over to the tub, turn on the taps, no time to cosset. Hurry, get him to that faucet. So I'll stop there. I would love to also talk to you about Tina Rabinovich, but I see that time is running short. So if you are curious to learn more about the exciting new research frontier of Yiddish children's literature, which is really only beginning to receive its due in Israel, in Europe, in the United States, there are some resources here. Maybe you can take a screenshot. And I'm going to stop there and thank you all for listening and hand it over to Stephanie.
I'm Stephanie Halpern, the director of the YIVO Archives, and I have the great fortune of being able to interact with these amazing original documents and books every day. And here at YIVO, we have over 1,000 children's books. And I've shown you just a few to show sort of the breadth of the collection, with really a particular focus on books that are visually interesting and really beautifully illustrated. So our collection contains various primers and books for young children, like this one, this counting book here, which was published in Odessa in 1934. And we also have books for learning the alphabet, like Mein Aleph Base, my alphabet, published in New York in 1927, written by Jacob Kaminsky and illustrated by the artist Nota Kozlovsky. And what I love about this particular book is that many of the words in here emphasize various professions and objects that have a utilitarian use. Here we see the baker and a saw, and my personal favorite, the needle. And this is very lovely poems accompany all of the images. And here the needle is, tasked with making clothes that that keep one warm and beautiful. And yet and you can see the needle is holding here a little sailor's uniform and a fur coat. But yet the needle always remains naked. And I think that most of the very beautifully illustrated books, some by very well-known artists, as we've heard, are stories for younger children, like this one, Dos Quetzala, the Kitten, written by Libkritko, whom Professor Udell spoke about. This book was published in 1935, and these illustrations are just really beautiful. This tells the story of a little boy and his little cat and the adventures and mischief they get into together. Libkritko's works were often about the sort of the ordinary lives of ordinary people, and this perhaps is one of the reasons why they were so popular. So this is a 1935 book, Yanta, for the holiday. And this text is about children at a holiday parade watching soldiers and workers and pilots go by and deciding amongst themselves who they would most like to be when they grow up. A particular favorite of mine by the Soviet Jewish writer Samuel Marshak, who Professor Kelly spoke about, is the Poached, and this is translated by Libkritko, published in 1934, and in this story, the Lodz postman tries to deliver a letter to Boris Zhitkov in Lodz, and he realizes that he's just missed him because Boris has left for Berlin. And the letter follows Boris's travels from Berlin to London. You can see here the double-decker buses here. Misses him in London, travels with him travels following him to Brazil, misses him in Brazil, and the letter is finally delivered to him when he gets to Lodz many months later. Of course, we have stories here that are based a bit more in folk culture, like Boboschlak and her pumpkin, and you can see here a bit of a difference in the illustration, more of a folk style here by Georg Fischer, and in this story, really I love this story. Boboschlak, as you can see, grows the biggest pumpkin, and she wants to do something with it, but is totally unable to carry it into her house. And she asks for help from people who live in town. They also cannot carry it. And a group of young children come around, youth come around, and they chop the pumpkin up for Boboschlak. Everyone carries the pumpkin into her house for her, and she cooks pumpkin knishes, but it turns out that the knishes are not very tasty, but the hogs don't mind. They love the knishes, and so they eat them all up. And as has been mentioned, the animal world does play a big role in Yiddish children's stories. This beautifully illustrated book involved in the Forest, published in 1921 in Berlin, illustrated by Issachar Ribach. And you can see a lot of his work draws inspiration from Russian folk art and traditional Jewish motifs, as you can sort of see here in these really striking illustrations that accompany Libkritko's text about a little boy who dreams he wanders into the forest and sees various animals. Zebra, giraffe. Another personal favorite of mine, and an adaptation of a Russian tale, is Fliegel Amigala, a tale about a fly who finds a purse of money and buys a samovar to have tea with all of their bug friends. But the party is interrupted by a terrible spider who captures Fliegel Amigala. As you can see here, Fliegel Amigala is caught in the web, and all of the other bug friends flee. They're no match for a spider. And who comes to the rescue? The heroic mosquito, who saves Fliegel Amigala. The two, of course, end up getting married, and all of the bugs dance and rejoice at the wedding. Even in a children's book, you've got to end with a good Jewish wedding. And a book that brings us a bit closer to home here in New York, A Hen Goes to Brownsville. These amazing illustrations, again, by Nota Kozlovsky. In this book, a hen travels to Brownsville, a neighborhood in Brooklyn, to lay eggs for the children because they're weak and pale because they don't have fresh eggs. And you can see here the hen is dropping eggs off of the bridge, off the Williamsburg Bridge. So as the hen wanders through the city, she causes quite a stir by laying eggs and singing songs, and she causes a traffic jam in Times Square, is taken to court where she's judged. She's found guilty, and she's fined $2, but of course, she's a hen, so she just lays eggs instead to pay her fine, and eventually makes her way to Brownsville and lays eggs for all of the children. Now, in addition to books written in specifically in Yiddish, as and Cesar touched on this a bit as well, we have a number of books, classics, in translation. And so this Dry Baron, Three Bears, as perhaps you can tell by the illustrations, is a Yiddish translation of Tolstoy's text about a little girl and three bears who goes and, sits in the seat, tastes the porridge. Of course, this is Goldilocks, but in this version, the little girl is not named at all. And to end with two other translations, a nice bookend, I think, to what Cesar showed us. We have Yiddish adaptation and translations of things like Gullivers Travels, which this edition was published by Farlag Yiddish, which is a publishing house that specialized in translations of literary classics. And they had a Kinderbibliothek series, a children's library series that appeared and so, Gullivers Travels appeared alongside other texts like Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin and fairy tales by the Brothers Grimm. And you can see here this great image of Gulliver being tied down by the Lilliputians. And I'll just end with one more, an illustrated translation, Yiddish translation of Kipling's The Elephant's Child. And the illustrations here are by El Lizitzky, who Professor Kelly mentioned, the great Russian avant-garde artist. And he was a much sought after children's book illustrator, and he illustrated something like 30 publications between 1918 and 1923. So this is just a very small sampling of the children's literature we have here at YIVO. And if you're interested in learning more about these books or any of the other archival materials that we have documenting the lives of Yiddish-speaking children, like photographs and notebooks, drawings, we even have children's toys, please visit our website, which I think we'll put in the chat. And this includes links to digitized materials we have, which you can access from home. And of course, if you find yourself in New York or if you're local, we encourage you to come see us here in the building. All of these materials and everything else we've got are open to the public for use.
Thank you all so much. These are really fascinating, lovely presentations. It's amazing to see all this material. And now we'll just take a few minutes for Q&A. We do have a lot of questions in the Q&A function. And if there's anyone else out there in the audience that has questions, please make sure to put them in the Q&A. I've seen a lot of interesting chatter in the chat, but we're going to take our questions from the Q&A function. Okay, so the first question here, one viewer asks, who is distributing these books to children? Did they give them away in schools, or were parents buying them? How are they making their way into the hands of the readers?
I can try to answer at least part of that one. So in Europe, particularly after World War I, there was just an extraordinary number of Jewish orphans. And so the schools were really very robustly in loco parentis. And so whatever books the children came to own were very likely distributed to them through school. In New York, obviously there are different considerations as we get later into the 20s and into the 1930s. But my sense is that distribution occurred largely through the schools, but that it wasn't rigid, because remember that, when you look at a neighborhood like Brownsville, where I was just spending some time this morning teaching Leipzig, reading it in Yiddish with a group of Yiddish students, there were kids whose parents were sending them to an Ordenschule, to one of the International Workers' Order schools, but there were other kids on the same block or in the same apartment building who were attending a Shalom Aleichem school, or one of the other kinds of Verband school, one of the Zionist schools. And so I'm sure that through informal social networks, these books got handed around and read together with each other. So I don't think that we're looking at really high walls at the level of reception. Now, that said, and I see that, Rochelle, you have another question about reception and how these were being received by maybe adults outside of these groups. There is a lot about the reception of these works that I haven't researched yet. I have a fellowship to do research this coming year and hopefully get answers to these questions. I have a feeling that I'll be hitting up Stephanie a lot with needs for all kinds of questions. But my sense is that it was more fluid than rigid.
Can I add something about this? Because actually the picture in the USSR is quite interesting. There is a book market in the 1920s. So during the new economic policy, there are publishers who are releasing children's titles actually to make money. I mean, they're one of the categories of books that sell better, and the state publishing houses, which is mainly, as far as I can work out, what the Opie collection comprises. I mean, I think because they were the ones that ended up in secondhand bookshops, and also would have been the ones that Marshak recommended. He's very involved in that sort of institutionally in that movement. And so they're the ones that are trying to compete with the private market and do it on a kind of relative shoestring. And I think the answer is we just don't know. I mean, it's always been assumed that children's books in the Soviet Union, they were just so fantastic. They automatically had an audience, a readership. And then actually you read things from a later period when I actually did some research on children's readership, and you see that people are saying, well, you know, you visit houses and there are people who've only got one children's book. I mean, actually, there's a bit of a myth about how, because these books were so fantastic, they automatically found an audience. And it just really badly needs work. We don't really have much in the way of modern literary sociology. I mean, there was a lot of work done on this in the 1920s, but there's been a sort of, you know, abeyance, and publishing institutions are just not as well researched as they should be, given this fantastic interest. But one of the things that the Soviet state did was to use book peddlers. So this is actually happening again. The book distribution system in Russia now is quite a lot of the time down to sort of, you know, young people in rucksacks who go out from major Moscow publishers, get a plane out to Novosibirsk or wherever else, and put the stuff from their rucksacks in local bookshelves. So they're the sort of modern equivalent of the peddlers, but there was a sort of attempt to get these Raznoshiki actually taking these books round. And I suppose probably that worked for Yiddish books also. It'd be interesting to look at that as a sort of...
Thank you so much. Here, there's another viewer asks about the Yiddish children's literature in British Mandate Palestine, especially in the context of the focus on Hebrew.
So yeah, I'll jump in and try. So I really, most of what I know about the situation with children's literature altogether in Mandate Palestine comes from reading the work of Yael Dar. So I would just like to kind of shout out her work. But I'm going to take the case of Levin Kipnis, who is a great example. He's one of the founding fathers of modern Israeli children's literature. He wrote something like 800 poems and 600 stories. I might have reversed it, but I know that it's, 800 and 1600. And in the 1950s, he publishes one volume of very Zionist children's stories in Yiddish, specifically for the Yiddish-speaking children of the diaspora. And from reading the introduction to that work, it seems like his own working assumption was that children in Eretz Yisrael would not have reason to be reading in Yiddish. This is a book that he is preparing for the children of New York and the Americas, seems to be his primary orientation. That said, one of the things on my to be read pile is Rachel Rozhansky's work on Yiddish in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel, and we'll see what we learn of what I learn when I read it about children's literature specifically.
Wonderful. One viewer points out that Boris Zhitkov from the Poached book, I think that was, is actually a writer in his own right, which is just a very interesting detail for us to know. One viewer asks about the use of this corpus of literature, and maybe this is a bit different for Yiddish versus Russian versus Hebrew, and maybe we can try to touch on each of those briefly. But the use of this literature today, either in translation or in reprints, and so both with the sense of looking at the words, but also the illustrations. Are any of these things having second or continued lives?
My impression is that of the things that I showed, not when it comes to the Russian things, I mean, there were in the Soviet period some interesting reprints, particularly Ivan Bilibin's sumptuous illustrated children's books from, again, the early 1900s, 1910s, and they were reproduced in quite high quality reprints, although nothing like as wonderful as the originals. I mean, the quality of paper was worse than that. But I think one of the things is that there's a very long history of Soviet children's books, and there were some very high quality examples later on. So the result of that is that it sort of effaced the memory of the early books. And I mean, the fact that these ended up in secondhand bookshops more or less not valued, I mean, has actually happened. People were able to pick up also avant-garde books that of the sort that are now worth, literally thousands of pounds, sometimes tens of thousands of pounds were available in secondhand bookshops in Moscow. I mean, it was just a sort of lost memory, as it were. I mean, you have to remember that avant-garde art was just not on the walls in Soviet museums until 1987, 1988. I mean, I remember seeing the first Tretyakov exhibition actually of these reserve collections since the sort of probably the mid to late 1930s. It had just completely disappeared. And so the result is that, they look at that and they sort of think, well, that's a weird drawing. I mean, that doesn't look much like a horse. I mean, it's my sort of reaction as a child to El Greco. It's pictures of horses, and it's kind of, I said arrogantly, I could do better than that, and was very quickly enlightened by, fortunately enlightened by adults. But I mean, it does take kind of education. I mean, sort of saturation in this. So I think that would be the answer for the Russian materials. And I mean, Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusian. I mean, again, I keep adding that these people are not just Russian. They have speakers of Russian, but it's a wider Lithuanian, sometimes Latvian, whatever.
So as far as Yiddish, I think that there are two things happening. One is that the Yiddish summer programs are booming. Yiddish Duolingo was released in April, and last time I checked, they had 200,000 registered users. So I think that as people studying the language come to understand what a resource children's literature can be for them in their growing fluency, that there will be something of a bump from that, but that also a lot of the work is happening through translation, and that starts with kind of literally translating the text, as I have been trying to do, and then we can get into other kinds of collaborations. So in late May, early June, Theater Emory released a magnificent puppet film directed by Jake Krakowski of Leipzig, the stories that I held up a few minutes ago. And it's just brilliant. It draws on all kinds of traditions of puppetry and paper art. And it's going to come back for another run at the end of August, beginning of September. I do not have the dates, but if you make a note of it and check the Theater Emory website, I think you can sign up to be notified when Leipzig comes back from his summer nap. So that's an example. I think that so many of these children's stories really want to be animated or to have a life as graphic novels, and that if people start to become aware of the treasures that are out there, we will see a market emerge. At least I hope so.
So there's so many questions. Unfortunately, we don't have time to get to everything today, but just a general note that the recording of this session will be on our YouTube channel. So if you want to check back and catch anything you missed, you can definitely find it there. And some folks have also asked if we can put together a list of the books mentioned. I think we should be able to do that. We'll get in touch with everyone and make a list and post it on the event page for this event. And finally, some viewers have asked about children's books that have a religious theme. Most of what we touched on today was secular. Is that something we could talk about briefly as a kind of final ending point?
So I'll go for that one, because this is a major theme in Yiddish. The literature that I spoke about really comes out of a world that understands itself as secular. But at the same time, many of the just Yiddishists and even some of the socialists would customarily reach back to a Jewish religious past in order to teach certain lessons, to create what they considered an account of Jewish ethics. They understood their own ethical commitments, including a politics of humanism and socialism, to draw directly from a wellspring of the Jewish, of biblical prophets, of medieval traditions. And so we do see a number of stories with religious themes of Sabbath observance, even being written by Bundists and by cultural Zionists. If you're interested in that particular theme, I have an article about it somewhere that I can send you to.
Yes, I mean, with the Russians, I think the easy answer is just that essentially assimilating to Russian meant assimilating to secular culture. I mean, I think those two things are very closely related to each other. And then right at the end of the Soviet period, there's a sort of complication of that picture because, in fact, discrimination against Soviet people who are, in inverted commas, Jewish by nationality creates much more interest in religious culture that had existed before. And, you know, right at the end of his life, I mean, the father of a friend of mine who was actually from Vitebsk was sort of displaying more interest in sort of, you know, visiting a synagogue occasionally, you know, kind of Jewish festivals, that sort of thing, just about remember it from childhood. But there's a big move against the whole sort of background, which you can see in sort of second and third generations in cities. I mean, somebody like David Samoilov, for example, I mean, there are these sort of memoirs who don't really recall anything much except their grandparents. Of course, the other thing is that after the legislation of 1918 and even more 1929, it was actually illegal to formally instruct children in religious faiths. And I mean, you know, sort of blind eye was turned to parents doing it. And I mean, I found an informant in London who, when I was working on the history of childhood, remembered being brought up in an observant Jewish family, and actually how they had a heder in Samarkand during exile. But that's extremely unusual. He recognized it as such, and he said, you know, just a handful of families were like this. So I think with that, I mean, you just wouldn't expect it. I mean, you might find manuscript books which would be really interesting if anybody looked for those. But I suspect probably people would have panicked and might well have destroyed them. But that's the only. I mean, you would want somebody like Valery Lifshitz really to ask about this. Dimshitz, sorry, Valery Dimshitz in St. Petersburg, who's, you know, immensely knowledgeable about, you know, all kinds of areas of generally the center of Judaica Center in the European University St. Petersburg is a real sort of center of expertise. So it would be worth addressing that question to them in the first instance.
Well, thank you all so much for these lovely presentations. I think we've all learned a lot today and gotten a real treat in getting to see so much beautiful literature and illustrations. And I'm sure we're going to be returning to this topic again soon. So thank you all very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for asking me to give the talk. It's been great.
Yeah, it was an honor to participate. Thank you.